everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Untold Truth. This is the podcast where we literally punch racism in the face. And so tonight is no other than every other opportunity that we get to speak about the things that you want to know about and literally want to learn more about. And that's why we're here. We're here to do that. And so tonight I have one of my very special friends here tonight. We're talking to Reverend Pastor Ben Boswell. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of who you're dealing with and what you can expect tonight. Tonight, we're coming straight from the church, but tonight we're not doing any church. We are literally going to talk about everything that might possibly be wrong in your church. So before we get there, Reverend Dr. Ben Boswell serves as the intersection of strategic leadership, spiritual formation, and social justice. Dr. Boswell is the creator and founder of Confronting Whiteness, a ministry committed to transforming people racialized as white into anti-racist practitioners in their spheres of power and influence. A former U.S. Army officer with degrees from Campbell University, BA, Duke Divinity School, a MDiv, and St. Paul School of Theology, a DMin. Dr. Boswell is a preacher, pastor, author, and civil rights leader who facilitates anti-racist education for people racialized as white and white dominant organizations. In 2021, at the age of 40, Dr. Boswell was awarded the City of Charlotte, North Carolina's prestigious Martin Luther King Jr. Medallion, which is the highest honor given to a person who promotes racial equality, social justice, and community services. He is the author of For the Facing of His Hour, Preaching That Resists White Christian Nationalism in 2022, and Confronting Whiteness, a Spiritual Journey of Reflection, Conversation, and Transformation in 2022. So as you can hear, Dr. Reverend Ben Boswell, greet the people.
Oh, well, Edwin, I'm honored to be here with you. And it's a real honor to be with one of my closest friends and also one of my heroes in the work of justice and equity in the world, Edwin. So thank you for the invitation to be here with you and with everybody who's joining us online tonight. Just grateful for our connection across the ocean, and how we are trying hard together to stay in solidarity with one another as we do the work of anti-racism and justice in two totally different contexts that also seem to have a lot in common as we do the work. So it's just been a joy. My relationship with you has changed the scope of my work and created an international lens to the work of justice that I do. And some of the scholars that I study and read believe that American social justice movements have really failed in their ability to reach out internationally and to connect internationally to the broader work of justice that's happening all over the globe. So we're trying to remedy that. I'm trying to do my own part in that, and Edwin has been a super help to me in that. So I'm really grateful to be here with you tonight.
Awesome, man. I'm so excited to start with this because I think there's a lot of conversations around how we need to bring the church into this conversation and the role that the church play in anti-racism activism, because for a long time the church have been silent on these issues and have not played the significant part that they played, for example, in apartheid or the civil rights movement in America. So we need pastors to come to the party and fulfill their roles and facilitate some of the acts that we need. But you are the example of that. That's why I'm so excited to have you in my life, because I love the fact that you challenge these norms and standards in the church, even though it sometimes comes at loss to you or heavy attacks from the physical enemies and the spiritual ones.
Amen.
But exactly. So we have to do what we have to do. This is the book for those who wants to know. It's Confronting Whiteness. We'll be talking a bit about this because Ben, please tell us about why it was necessary for you to write this book. I mean, the book is phenomenal. It's not just a general book where you read, but it's also a training manual where you guide pastors and those who feel led by the Spirit to get involved in the anti-racism activism part of this work. it is also a guide for them in terms of that. But you found it necessary to write this. The title itself says a lot: confronting whiteness, a spiritual journey of reflection, conversation, and transformation. Why did you write it? Why was it important, my brother?
Well, I really appreciate the setup there, and thanks for showing the book, a little promo for us. Just for those who want to know more about it, and this is a whole nother side story about whiteness at some point, but my publisher had a change in their staff, and they have unpublished that book. So I had to go find a new publisher. So now a new version of it is coming out through Orbis Books in February. So if you're trying to get a copy, be patient with me. That's a whole nother story about whiteness, but it's a setup to tell you everywhere in the world, and particularly here in a white dominant context like America, there is this pervasive white supremacy is what a lot of people call it. But for my journey, I was a pastor. I was raised as a child of Methodist ministers, and my family was at least moderate, if not generally liberal. And I went to liberal academic schools, and I thought I was, back before this was a term, I thought I was woke. I had lots of Black friends. I listened to a lot of Black music. I was a part of the culture, I thought, in some ways, here in America, and had a deep appreciation for the culture. And so I kind of thought I was one of the good ones, good liberal, good ally in the work of justice. And the catalyst for me was leading churches through processes of talking about race, particularly white dominant progressive churches, and finding myself constantly frustrated because it would usually be catalyzed. The conversation would begin with some event that happened, the police killing of an unarmed Black man, usually, or some event like that, or Charles, the Mother Emanuel shooting, or something horrible, horrific racist act. And then the church would say, we really need to talk about race. And the conversation would be so shallow and unhelpful and go nowhere. And even after we would have the conversation, the church itself would not change. And I started getting frustrated. What's going on with that? At the same time, my spouse and I, my partner, we decided to adopt a child here in America. And the child that was placed with us was an African-American child. And so I've been raising a Black daughter in America for the last 13 years. Nothing will radicalize you more than trying to raise a Black daughter in America in this moment in America. So for 13 years, I've been on that journey, trying to figure out what's my responsibility as a white father, having a Black daughter in this moment in American history. Also, the year that she was born was the year that Michelle Alexander published The New Jim Crow, and we started to raise awareness about how the carceral state is replicating in many ways what enslavement looked like in America. And so there are more Black people incarcerated in America today than there were on all the plantations in America in 1860, which tells you a lot about how the carceral system has come to replace the plantation as the primary place of oppression in American life. That was coming to the fore at the same time that my daughter was born. That's also when Black Lives Matter popped off after the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so it's been a very fast education for me and for a lot of folks in America. I realized that I had been thinking that I was on the team and been a good liberal ally actually was the biggest blind spot that I had. My own liberalism, my own self-righteousness about my liberalism, my own thinking that I was anti-racist was becoming a blind spot to my own progress in confronting my own racial identity. And I realized that if I wasn't willing to do that work of looking at my own whiteness, my own racial identity, that it was the same. I couldn't lead my congregation down that road. And so I made a decision to take a serious, intentional spiritual journey, theological, educational, to go look at whiteness and what it is and try to understand my racial identity. I felt like the way to do that, and I had been taught this by other activists and organizer friends, was to read people of color specifically writing about whiteness. Don't just go read what white people say whiteness is. Read what people of color over the last 200, 300 years have said about whiteness. I went into it, Edwin, you know this, I've said this to you before. I went into it as a white person thinking, I'm going to find something redeemable about whiteness. I'm going to go find the thing about whiteness that I can, polish off and save or redeem or reconcile. But instead, I found nothing more than an evil lie that needs to be confronted in order for me to reclaim any sense of humanity. So let me kind of break down a little bit of what I found as simply as I can, and then we can expand on it.
Yeah.
Uh, I went in looking to try to find something redeemable, that whiteness, there's something good at the base of it that just mutated and ugly. But instead, what I found was that whiteness is a lie European Christians created to justify stealing.
Mm.
Stealing lots of things: people, land, power, money, resources. And that lie was so powerful that it became the identity of the very people that engaged in that activity. So much so that they lost the sense of their connection to humanity as they continued to profit off of this lie, and steal based on this lie. And it's many civilizations now at this point are built on that lie at the foundation of it. That lie, of course, oppresses the people who had things stolen from them, like their autonomy, their civilizations, their land, some people themselves, in fact, were stolen. Individuals who were stolen as a part of the transatlantic slave trade and other forms of colonization that took place in history. So that's how I would break down whiteness. I also found that it was Christians who were the ones that constructed it. So it is not just a theoretical concept. It is a theologically developed concept. I don't think it was good theology that developed it, but there was a theological basis behind the development of the concept of whiteness. So I don't see whiteness. I do believe that there are individual people who look like me, who are redeemable, who are trapped in the lie of whiteness. But I don't believe that whiteness is redeemable, because evil is not redeemable. Evil has to be confronted. Evil has to be opposed. And so the reason for the title, Confronting Whiteness, is that I believe whiteness is a form of evil, and it's a lie that we're trapped in, an evil lie that we're trapped in. And not just white folks who are trapped in this lie. There are people of color who have also internalized this lie, and who are also trapped into, Black folks and people of color are also trapped in this lie in different ways. There's a lot of colorism, I know, in Africa, when we've talked about before, where the lighter you are,
Yeah.
the more power you have, more. So that lies in America too, and that's also related to whiteness.
Yeah. It's interesting because what you have touched on in terms of whiteness is obviously a big part of what you are dealing with in the book, and understanding whiteness in relation to various aspects within the church. Specifically, I want to look at and come back to something you said, or just noted on, which is being in the church and being white, and the church being part of this narrative of whiteness as superiority. How do we speak to some of the pastors? Because tonight is very important for me, because the church has been growing in a significant way, because these white churches popping up everywhere, because people see the economic value that it brings to their lives. We have all this charismatic movements popping up everywhere, and it's all to do with all this wealth, money, and so. But at the heart of capitalism, we know white supremacy and the oppression of Black people still remain a key part. So, speaking to pastors in the church, what does a pastor look like? What are we looking for as the new age pastor that is actually um, conscious about the issues that we're dealing with in the church? And what should people in the pews be looking for if they looking for a home in a church and in a pastor?
Whew. Yeah, that's a big question. Um, so I want to start by framing this as saying I'm going to speak now very truthfully, but I'm going to do so as an act of love, as a pastor who has a heart for people and has a heart for the poor. And I have myself in my own life been betrayed by the church, and betrayed by religion, and betrayed by pastors who have lied to me, who have tried to teach me theologies that were wrong and incorrect, that I've had to spend a lot of my life unlearning and relearning new ways of thinking about God and Christ and Jesus and how to follow Jesus and the Bible. So I just want to say I have too been in a place where I have felt betrayed. So I'm speaking out of that place, out of love. I'm going to say the truth here. But there are a lot of false preachers out there, false teachers. And the false teachers are not, as we often assume, those who are out there, with new ideas and heretical ideas about the Trinity or Christology. The primary form of false gospel in the world today is what we call the prosperity gospel. And the prosperity gospel is rooted in whiteness. It was developed in a context of whiteness. It's a specific response to late stage capitalism. We're no longer, the church looks out and says, you can't win, can't beat them, join them. We can't beat the capitalists, so we're going to join the capitalists. And so a lot of pastors have decided to find ways to manipulate. The only way you can do this is to manipulate the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament and a lot of places in the proof text places in the Hebrew Bible to make it seem like God wants all of us to be wealthy. And the only reason we're not is because we don't pray hard enough and we don't have enough faith. And that is oppressive to the poor at the very start. Let's just start there. That is incredibly oppressive to the poor because it's not just oppressive and exploitative, but it's a nasty trick. It's a dirty trick because it's giving poor folks two things. One is a sense of hope that one day they'll be rich if they just pray harder and have faith, which is not going to happen just because of that. Unless the economic system changes, there's going to be poor people. And two, it makes them give money to people who are already wealthy and are making piles of money off of the poor, right? That's why they're putting these churches in these poor towns and making everybody tithe 10%. And these pastors are driving around in nice cars and really fancy shoes. Here we have a Instagram page that kind of makes fun of these pastors for the sneakers that they wear called preacher sneakers. And it shows them up on stage wearing $1,000 sneakers, right? And $1,000 in American money, right? That's a lot of money. And so you could buy a car for some of the prices of these sneakers that they've got. So they're just kind of lampooning the wealth, the excessive wealth. And so this prosperity gospel is born in an idea in a white culture, in a capitalist culture. It's a response to capitalism. It's a we can't beat them, so let's join them idea. And it loses all the edge of Jesus's teachings, which Jesus talked about money more than anything else. And he always said that money, wealth was a peril, was a danger. Too much wealth is a danger to your soul. And so the thing we have to do when we have wealth is give it away. It's an obligation. The only way to save ourselves from this thing that we're trapped in this society is to give that money away to those who are struggling. That's the only way to save our souls. That's why Jesus constantly says, give alms to the poor, give everything you have to the poor, right? And then come follow me. The rich can't go through. It's harder for the rich person to get to heaven than a camel, right? To go through the eye of a needle. So there's teachings that Jesus, there's no way around them except to manipulate them if you're doing prosperity gospel. I will say that attached to that prosperity gospel is a gospel of, I call it the false whiteness. It's a false witness of whiteness. It's a false witness. And it's a gospel that associates whiteness along with wealth with righteousness and truthfulness and goodness, all those things. And so, that day that might makes right, that old phrase, might makes right. In church as white makes right, whatever's white is right. And that's a lie. That's a lie. And I face this every day. We face this in American churches, which are predominantly white dominant. There's a lot of division in churches in America. But even the ones where there is integration, they tend to be places that are still, centered in whiteness. The music comes from the white tradition.
Correct.
The way people act in that space, the people in power are people who are white. And so there's a lot of work to confront that. So I think when you're looking for a pastor, first telltale sign is if they're preaching prosperity, you should run. That's the first thing. Run. But even more subtle than that, if their church is not actively working to be anti-racist, specifically, and not just in teaching only, but in practice, in the streets, in their work in the community. If they're not partnering with organizations that are on the ground doing work on social justice, right? If they're not concerned with poverty and not just telling poor people they need to have more faith, but actually helping people who are oppressed by poverty, helping them find their way in this world that is very harsh, then you can tell your church is probably not preaching the right thing. It doesn't matter no matter how nice your pastor is, no matter how
Yeah.
kind he is, if he doesn't have a perspective where we start with, the Bible is filled with the same refrain that true religion is one that puts the orphans and the widows and the strangers and the poor first, right?
Mm.
That is true religion from start to finish. You can go anywhere. The only way to not see that is to pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
And if we just focus there and say that's what the church is about in the world, the church is here to exist, to make the world a better place for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized. And if we begin with them, it will make the world better for everybody.
Absolutely. It's interesting the reference that you're making with regards to the camel going to the eye of the needle is obviously to do with Zacchaeus and his story, the rich man in the Bible. But one of our political thought leaders, Dr. Alan Bussap, he recently, I listened to a conversation he had with somebody in the US that he co-authored the book with. And he wrote one of the chapters that is a different perspective on Zacchaeus and the story of how he basically found himself up in that tree, but profoundly afterwards what he did was
Mm.
more profound than him being in the tree. And so we always hear about him being in the tree and that significant impact of that moment. But the after effect is what they are looking at it, the chapter, which only based on the reference, listening to them, he speaks about the fact that Zacchaeus said afterwards that those who he has wronged, he will pay back 40 times more. So it kind of leads me into this conversation, even within the church, that we need to have in our structures of anti-racism, which also deals with reparations. So if we look at the Bible, we look at all these stories that enforces our belief systems and how we live amongst each other and with each other. If I understand correctly how you have dealt now with wealth and how wealth corrupts the soul and it delineates you from where you need to be. How do we understand this thing of reparations, and how does the church play a role in reparations, especially when Zacchaeus is saying to us that I need to give back 40 times more than I took from you?
Right. Yeah. I love this question. And I've thought of that passage as focused on restorative justice or reparations for a long time. And it's excessive. What Zacchaeus does is an act of radical reparations in that moment, which is often overlooked with all the songs about him being in the tree and him being a wee little man. That's the ones I hear. Him being short and in the tree, which we don't
Yeah,
really know all the backstory. That's kind of a misinterpretation. But yeah, so the reparations part is really clearly there in the text, and I think a lot of times Christians have misunderstood what the word justice means. We think it means the work of fairness, right? We need to make things fair and equal.
yeah,
But the only way to make things fair and equal is to pay back what is owed, right? So if somebody sues you, if somebody drives their car on your lawn and tears up your lawn, or drives their car into their house and hits your side of your house, they can't just pull their car out and say, I'm really sorry about that, and go
mm,
on.
yeah,
No, they actually have to pay to have the house fixed, right? There's an insurance claim. The house has to be fixed back to what it was. So if you apply that principle of justice to the issue of in the history of 400 years of slavery in America, for instance, or even longer, 500-600 years of colonialism in the world, and all that has been taken and all that has been stolen, just giving back. For instance, if the British Museum just gives back all the things it took from Africa, that doesn't make things right. That just gives back what was stolen.
mm,
to make things right, you have to go back and count the cost of all that was lost through the fact that it was stolen and then possessed for hundreds of years. And
Yeah.
having it in your possession created wealth. People come over there and do tourism and they're looking at it, and all the things that come when you steal something. Or here in America, where people's bodies, right, were, and all over the Americas, were taken from another place, stolen, and then forced to work as an unpaid working class here in America for years, and then once freed, then forced into servitude through an economic system and a punishment system, and then a Jim Crow system that was similar to the apartheid that you had in South Africa. What does that cost? How much could you possibly pay to make that back? It's been so bad. So I think part of the reason why white folks get so resistant to it is, first of all, our whiteness makes us think we're right and good and what we did wasn't bad. And so we go into denial. But even those who want to do the right thing get so overwhelmed by how much we would have to pay to make it right that they just shut down.
Yeah.
And to me, that shouldn't make us shut down. That should make us all the more adamant about the fight for reparations of some kind, because we've stolen so much. We've taken so much unjustly. We have so much to repay. We need to get started on this. So
I think that's another misinterpretation with the Bible. If you speak about restorative justice, a lot of people think restorative justice is about the process of, for example, in South Africa, with the reconciliation process of forgiveness. And nothing about that forgiveness speaks about the economic impact that it had for those families who lost their loved ones during those times of apartheid. And so I think those are critical conversations that we need to understand. And it highlights, and again, now I'm going to say something and it's going to not be on the conversation we're having now, but it adds to it on the side. But I heard somebody say, because India just launched a rocket onto the moon, so they just landed on the moon, India, and then some of these European uh, online influencers came out and said, "Well, I think it's time we stop paying reparations or whatever they call it, the money we've been supporting India with. I think it's time that we stop giving money, because if they can land on the moon, they don't need our money anymore." And it's that disconnect in understanding all these hundreds of years of colonialism where you extracted billions from these countries. Therefore, we're still struggling to barely make it as a developing country, or as developing countries, because of the impact of your greed, your evil, your denigrating of all our cultural and religious beliefs and our human being, humanness that we had here. You denigrated all of that for your own benefit, that led to billions and billions of dollars or pounds, whatever you counted in. And now you want to complain or throw a tantrum because India landed on the moon. So I think also within that, Christianity has played a big role in training these minds to be ignorant about our role. How do we as the church become more present? And now it comes to some of the training in the book, because you train pastors, you've also trained some pastors here in South Africa on understanding how to use history as a format to be better, do better, and to be more active in restorative justice. Speak to us a little bit about that.
Well, we have to, when we look at history, this is a fascinating question. And I want to just first be reminded that Jill Scott Heron, an American jazz artist, has a great song called Whitey on the Moon that everybody should listen to. So that will help balance out these calls from the Europeans about what they should do with reparations to India. We have to go back into our history and understand the church's role, the role of pastors, the role of priests, the role of theologians in colonialism specifically. Let's start there. The church was the tip of the spear of colonialism. Missionaries were always sent first. And they weren't just sent with the Bible and the gospel. They were sent there with a deformed understanding of humanity, of who was a human and who was not. And they went to places where human beings were and told those human beings, and then told other people who had sent them, that there are not humans here. There are these other people, and they use terms that are horrific, like savages or primitive peoples, which is completely inaccurate. If there anything's primitive, it's the world we live in now, and the world
Yeah.
created by this industrial revolution and the technological place that we're in now. This is the primitive world, if there's anyone that I saw. An indigenous world is not a primitive world, right? But they came to these places where people were living in harmony with the land, where people had built their own societies, where people had not, had never maybe heard about the gospel. Sometimes they had, sometimes they hadn't. And they came to them with a deformed understanding of what it means to be human. And they said, this is the God. They tied this idea of the gospel with their understanding of their own culture and their own civilization. And they tied it with this diseased understanding of who's human and who's not. And they decided to impose that on places where they went. Once that groundwork was laid, it was very easy for the corporation to come next, and for the corporation to begin to extract people, land, resources, power, and to, as Walter Rodney said, underdevelop places in the world. It's not that they didn't develop them, they underdeveloped them. They regressed places by taking their natural resources, by upsetting their government systems, by challenging their cultures, by introducing Christianity not as the gospel itself, but as a civilizing and assimilating element that made people into, tried to form people who were from a different culture into these European Christians. Really, it was like an assimilation formation. I'm not saying anything you don't already know here, Edwin, and folks have experienced this on a very real basis all over the world.
Yeah.
But we have to take ownership of the fact that the church was involved in that, and that our theology was already broken when we decided to do that, because we had the Catholic Church and others say that the people, anyone who lives on lands, right, the doctrine of discovery, anyone who lives on a land and they're not people of faith, and by that we mean Catholics at that time,
Mm.
and they don't submit to you when you get there, you can kill them because they're not considered human like we are, because we believe in the one true God. And so
Mm.
religion played a civilizing, colonializing role as missionaries went all over the world. Does that mean that Christianity itself is permanently corrupted and broken? No, I don't believe that necessarily. I believe there's something pure in the gospel and Jesus' teachings about that is beautiful and pure when it's distilled to its truth. But when you combine it with, British culture,
Yeah.
and suddenly you don't have the gospel anymore. You have British culture disguised as the gospel. And so we have to go all the way back. This is true of all forms of religious nationalism that came out of a particular place, like the Dutch entity to empire. We
Yeah.
ruined Christianity. It's sort of like, I use a metaphor of when you, but it sure messes up the ice cream, right? So when you mix Christianity with empire, right,
Yeah.
it doesn't help the empire, right? That's the manure, but it
Yeah.
messes up the Christianity. That's the ice cream, right? It destroys the ice cream. You can't eat the ice cream anymore.
Yeah.
And so we have to recognize that and get into that history as pastors and tell the truth about that, and ask ourselves, okay, what were the theological ideas that led us to believe certain people were less human? And
Yeah.
then go into those ideas and rethink them, and reconstruct those ideas, and then try to come up with a more human version, a truer version of Christianity.
Yeah. It's interesting because I also think that while there, and I agree with you, I think there was something pure about the concept of religion, or the idea of what it was once before empire got into the conversation. While we are now living in a very different dispensation than the one where the Bible was initiated and how it got to us, I think when we're sitting here today, the religion has turned into something completely different and it looks different. So the way we approach some of these conversations, I think, also need to be a little bit different. We need to be more open and more accommodating to more people because there's a lot of difference in the world that we have not been comfortable with for a very long time. That being said, I think it's very interesting. Um, the civil rights movement leaders, you have the likes of Martin Luther King, who was also a religious man. You have Malcolm X, a religious man. You
Mhm.
have Nelson Mandela. He was religious. You can go down the line, Biko. Many of
Right.
these leaders were all religious people who grew up in the church and who had God at the center of their being. So even their courage and their ability to fight the evil systems of Jim Crow or segregation in America and apartheid in South Africa was based on these ideas that they have religious power through God who they serve.
Mm. Mm.
So where did we lose that level of bravery in the church where we stood up to all systems of oppression and injustice? Where did we lose it? One, the church. Where have we lost that? Because it's lost in South Africa, and I believe
Mm.
you will tell us it's also lost in the US. How? Where did we lose it, and how do we gain back that type of bravery and just a deep rooted need for justice and to fight for even the least in society? Because I think we've lost that as well.
I would say that for the white dominant church, they never had it. We
Mm,
never had it. And the only way we got it is through communities, religious communities that were oppressed, that taught us how to do it and modeled it for us. So all the people that you mentioned, I would notice, came out of religious communities that were oppressed by the dominant culture. And that's
mm,
because, and the reason I think that that's true is because, and why I believe that they revealed a true part of religion, the truest aspects of religion is almost all religious movements are anti-imperial. They have to have
mm,
empire added to make them into nation states, theocracies, these hierarchical ideologies. They have to have empire added. Christianity had empire added, right? Islam has empire added. Hinduism has empire added. And I could mention all the other ones. And when it has empire added again, it's just like the manure in the ice cream, right? Um, but I think that there have been oppressed religious communities who have revealed to us what true religion is meant to be because of their social location. And so,
mm,
and the reason they reveal what's true is because the Bible was written about and by an oppressed people, right?
mm,
So the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, at least throughout the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, were an oppressed people, right? Their story is their story of the liberation from empire. And then when they build their own empire, it's constantly corrupted by all these kings. So they have to have prophets come along and tell them this is wrong, this is wrong. This you don't have prophets until you have monarchy, right? So
yeah,
all these prophets pop up and tell them this is not what God intended. This is not what the law was for, which was for orphans and widows and the poor and a community of love and equity. And you've created you've just basically just taken people back to Egypt. You've built a new
yeah,
Egypt in all these eras, right? And the prophets are constant. So Jesus comes out of that prophetic tradition and is saying, we're in Egypt again, and it's Rome. And you're just, a lot of you religious leaders are just supporting the Roman Empire through your
yeah.
religions instead of actually practicing what the Torah taught us to practice. And so in that encounter comes out of that a form of Christianity. But it's always, the Bible's story is always anti-imperial if it's
Mm,
read correctly, which means that people who are oppressed groups within empire always read the Bible better than those who are in the dominant seat. So that's why I have to take the time as a person who is at the center and intersection of a lot of privilege here in America to read the interpretations of the Bible done by, for instance, poor campesinos in Nicaragua, or folks in Africa, or books by Black liberation theologians and womanist theologians and Latin American liberation theologians and disability theologians. And I mean, just all the LGBTQ theologians who show
yeah,
me how the empire has infected the faith that I hold and changed the way we interpret the Bible. So we always tend to see ourselves as the hero in the story, but if we're coming from a social location of privilege, we're not the hero in the story. We're usually who Jesus is talking against.
Yeah,
We have to, so it's how we read the Bible has to change based on our social location. And that's why those who are oppressed groups reveal to us the truth of it, because they're coming out of the experience that's very similar to the people the Bible was written by and for, which is the Hebrew people, and their experience. And I think throughout history, right, part of what the shadow side of Christianity has always been its hatred of Jewish people and Judaism, right?
yeah,
Its attempt to try to create its identity over and against Jewish identity and Jewish life. And so anti-Semitism starts as soon as Christianity starts, 200 AD.
yeah,
So you have this, and then you have pogroms and the Crusades and the Holocaust, and it's just constant anti-Jewish. And so it's not surprising then that as Christian Europe coalesces together, that they turn their similar anti-Semitic sites towards people of color, people in the global South, through colonialism and then slavery. And so it's the same theology that thought we should kill the Jews, right? That says, oh, we can now enslave Africans, right? That's the same
yeah.
theology.
It's interesting because talking about this, where we lost our bravery, and when you speak about the connection to the empire and how Christianity basically adopted that in order to have this hierarchies. I think a lot of our church leaders have become so accustomed to the hierarchy more so than understanding the justice that we need to fight for. And so liberation theology and restorative justice has now become secondary to self-enrichment and self-indulgence, which is the white understanding of church and how these white churches have almost enforced that consciousness on our people. So that's something that we have to find ways to undo, and obviously find ways to deal with that. But you touched on something important, so now this have not been discussed. I think a lot of what we're discussing is also part and parcel of how your book leans on training people to better understand context and history and everything else that enforces your consciousness, whether you are racialized as white or black, but specifically for white people. Now, in saying that, you spoke just now about the Jewish people, and so I'm just gonna throw this in here because I think it's an important conversation to have. We have Palestine, and we have Egypt, and we have these fights, but it's obviously modern day apartheid and oppression of a people. And then there's also this idea and conversation, which to me feels a lot more like white supremacy, a chosen people. This idea that you deserve to be um, superior and in the position to oppress others. Um, what's your idea or your thinking around that situation?
So this is a I think the question around Jewish relationships with Israel and then Israel's relationship with Palestine is
Yeah.
complex, because to me, I would start by saying, here in America, Jewish people have become white, right? There has been a process for many European immigrant groups of going from being Irish to then
Mm,
assimilating into whiteness and getting granted white status. Italians did that in America through a very concerted process, first through mob violence, then through baptizing Christopher Columbus, then through getting elected to political office. There's been a long history. We don't look at we look at what they did in the mob with this valor. Look at The Godfather and the way we
mm,
valorize Italian violence. And that was part of their way of assimilating into whiteness. There was a time when Jewish folks in America were not white. And there is still anti-Semitism towards Jewish folks in America, particularly because what we've seen from the far right here lately. There's attacks on synagogues, attacks on individuals. It's been ramped up by the rhetoric of the former president and others. And you saw what happened in Charlottesville. I could go on.
Yeah.
So the complicated part of thinking about Jewish folks and their relationship to oppression and power in the world today is very complex because they are one of the longest historically oppressed groups in human history, who have maybe experienced as much, if not more, oppression than any other group for the longest period of time, right? And at the same time, they have now, in some ways, married, at least at Israel, married their religion with empire. And so
Mm.
same problems. You got the same problems there that you have when Christianity is married with empire. It's the manure and the ice cream again. And so I see the relationship of Israel and Palestine through the lens of empire and its connection. I do believe that, there's like a hard Zionism and a soft Zionism. The soft Zionism to me says people who are Jewish have the right to have a state somewhere, right? Then there are others that say it has to be here and it's this territory and you can't be here. I mean, so there's a soft Zionism and hard Zionism. And I think we have a hard time distinguishing the two. So if you say anything negative, you're immediately called an anti-Semitic person. If you have any critique at all, if you talk about apartheid at all, and I am in really close relationship with the rabbi here in town. He and I are probably the closest colleague. He's the closest colleague I have here in Charlotte, and we talk a lot about this issue. I think it's more complex in that situation because of the history of oppression, how long it is, the desire for a home, a protected home in the Middle East, in an original home site, its relationship to the West, and its relationship to empire. It makes it much more complex. I mean, are people
Yeah.
being oppressed? Absolutely. But I don't want to get into a place where we just say, oh, all Jews have become the oppressors, because that is an anti-Semitic idea.
Yeah.
Many Jews are still oppressed wherever they are in the world. And Israel, in its particular state, would say that they are surrounded on all sides by people who don't want them to exist. So they
Yeah.
feel like they're fighting for their lives. Anyway, I think it's complex. I will say I don't think how Palestinians are being treated is fair. I think it is unjust and unethical, and try to stay in solidarity with the people of Palestine on this. But I think we have to be careful of how we look at it so that we don't create sloppy forms of future oppression by just saying. To me, the thing that goes back to is what you already brought up is once you marry empire with religion, problems every single time you're going to have oppression.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing clarity to to your position and how you understand this and how you approach this. I just have to say, I said Egypt, I meant Israel.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so, so, yeah.
I knew
So
what you meant. I knew what
yeah,
you meant.
exactly. You have to clarify. We don't want to have problems that we didn't need. But I hear what you're saying, and I think that is a complexity. The oppression is not complex; it's very clear. It's there, and it needs to be dealt with. I think as modern day leaders, we need to be able to speak about these things and find ways to better exist as humanity, so that we don't get into these type of situations where we're constantly killing each other in order to exist and to have a piece of land. I think it's
Exactly.
also this narrative of this is where we belong and this is my piece of land, and so if anybody comes onto this, I can kill whoever comes and deters my destiny. So and like you said, I think that's also something that we have to take into account, that it has been over a long period of time that the suppression has taken place. And so like Franz Fanon also highlights that after a period of time, the oppressed becomes the oppressor, and so it
Right.
also lives within us to be that type of people. But yeah, time for us is always too short, and it runs out so quickly. And so I just want to jump into the book, various chapters that you run through, and each chapter has a concept and an idea that people need to go and study and learn. And then you come back, you have conversations, you have dialogue, and then it's facilitated with concepts of learning and understanding how to be anti-racist and conscious about anti-racism within the church. So just speak about the internal process of the book and how it helps church leaders to be better equipped to lead their congregations.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you. Let's get into it a little bit. The book is structured very carefully. It comes out of a long educational process, a research process that I went through, where I studied how white congregants in my own context and in other places would go through a pilot version of this, and what helped them and what didn't help them. And some of the things I learned coming out of that is it's some of the techniques here that are used are not always common in other anti-racist trainings. For instance, we only, as people who are racialized as white, we look to people of color and Black folks here in American context as the experts on whiteness, which is the
Hmm.
opposite of what you would think. Uh, we don't look to other white folks to tell us about what whiteness is. We look to people of color who are putting up a mirror and showing us, and have been for generations, to so that we can see ourselves through their eyes, because we know what we look like through our eyes: good, righteous, wonderful. But through their eyes, we see a totally different picture. And what we see through those eyes, or how the chapters are laid out here, I categorize them based on who the authors are and what picture they paint of whiteness. And one is whiteness as power. You could also say whiteness as class collaboration, whiteness as a political formulation. That's one. Whiteness as power. Then we do whiteness as evil. That's where we read a lot of Malcolm X, as you can imagine,
Yeah, yeah,
and look at the marks of evil and how we think about evil as theologians and theological people, and how whiteness bears the marks of what we have historically described as evil. Then we look at whiteness as terrorizing, that there's a terrorizing legacy to this. We look at the enslavement, we look at the plantation state, we look at colonialism, we look at the ways in which whiteness has been terror. And then on a micro level too, like just the way police operate in Black neighborhoods in America, just the way that microaggressions are happening in the white dominant workplace with people of color all day long, every day. And
yeah,
then we look at whiteness as a mythology. We go back to James Baldwin a lot there and look at how it's constructed as a myth that we think is true, but it's actually false. Then we move to whiteness as a principality. This one's similar to evil, but it's more theological language. The powers and principalities that Paul talks about. These are the forces of domination in our world, and how whiteness attaches itself to forces of domination and becomes a part of the forces of domination in our world. And then we look at whiteness as nationalism, and how whiteness has aligned itself with nation states and become, in America, one of the things that's constantly up for discussion is, are Black Americans actually Americans? Well, if they don't have all the rights and privileges, when did they become Americans in American history? What year was it that they became Americans? So Toni Morrison has this line, is like, Black, we're always /American, African /American. White Americans don't say that, white /American. They just say American, right? And so who is an American, and why are they an American? And what rights and privileges come with them just because of the way that they're racialized in America, and how America operates. I mean, obviously, January 6th would not have looked the way it looked if whiteness did not have power. If a group of Black people had stormed the Capitol, they would have all been shot and killed, right?
yeah,
And it would
absolutely.
have been a massacre. But because
Yeah,
it was white folks, they were treated with soft gloves. They got to run around into these rooms and break in windows and put on outfits and dance around like crazy folks, because their whiteness gave them the power to do that. So we look at the ways in which whiteness these are kind of subcategories of the overarching idea
yeah,
of whiteness, ways of getting into them
yeah,
theologically. And then I would say, I don't recommend that white folks try to just pick up the book and walk through it by themselves. I mean, you can do that and you can get a lot out of it, but it's intentionally meant to create a confrontation with you and an existential crisis with your own identity as someone racialized as white. It's going to create that existential crisis because I intended it to do that, but I intended it to do that in a small group setting where you're surrounded with spiritual practices from the church, like meditation and prayer and confession, and you're with a small group of predominantly, racialized as white folks for the most part, that you can walk together through this journey with a trained facilitator who can help hold you accountable week in and week out, and you can build the muscle strength to stay longer in that feeling of discomfort that happens when we confront this reality. So I built a container that I think helps the white folks to look at this hard thing, to look at themselves through this lens, and to become stronger and better anti-racist practitioners as they come out the other side.
Yeah, I think something that's critical for me, and what I really enjoyed about the book is the fact that you link all this racial, social, and restorative justice work to biblical context. I think that for me is amazing, because I think a lot of people see um, social racial justice work as outside of the church. And we often hear that the church and politics don't go, you need to keep religion out of politics and things like that. And for me, it's always been the same thing. You need to deal with both in order to get anywhere in life. And you've brought the two together, and the book also allows for people to see that, but also to experience how the Bible is also, much like the constitution of your country, a active document of liberation and struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
like that fact, and I think that for me is an amazing part of how you brought that work together.
Well, I love that you brought that out and we're able to see that in the work that I did. I've been through a lot of racial justice trainings here in America, the Racial Equity Institute, and we've been on pilgrimages through the Deep South. And I can't tell you, just countless numbers of racial justice trainings. Very few of them are rooted in the church and in the gospel.
Mm,
And so what that does, unfortunately, is it makes it seem like racial justice is an issue among many lists of issues that we ought to be social justice issues. Have you heard them? I'm sure you've heard them described that way.
yeah,
Social
yeah,
justice
yeah.
issues. Well, the church is not supposed to have issues. The church is about relationships. So
Mm,
I don't see, when you see it as an issue, you can say, I have my faith over here and my politics over here. I have my faith over here and social justice is over here. And they inform each other, but they're not the same thing, right?
yeah,
I would totally disagree. I think faith is about a relationship, and so is social justice.
yeah,
And everything is
absolutely.
about relationships. So for instance, you and I, right? You live in a different context than me. You have been racialized as different than me. So if I show up with you and I'm like, Edwin, your experience, I don't buy it. I don't believe it. You told me about it. I don't care. That's not helping us with a relationship, right?
Yeah,
That's not a relationship. That's just me being paternalistic and white and colonialist, just telling you that I don't believe in your experience. So if I do want to have a relationship with you, then I have to hear your struggle.
yeah,
And when you tell me your struggle, if my relationship is a relationship that is spiritual, then your struggle and my becomes my struggle,
yeah,
right? That's not an issue. I don't have a position. I don't have an issue. It's like there's racial justice and LGBTQ justice, and no, I have relationships with women and LGBTQ people and
yeah,
people of color and Black folks and Africans and people in Cuba, and I have relationships with these folks. And if I want my relationships with those folks to be spiritually right, that makes me an anti-racist. That makes me a person who wants to confront the powers of oppression that are hurting my people, right?
yeah,
So I think the church has totally failed in understanding the concepts of race, gender, sexuality, not as issues, but as relationships. And that they're not add-ons to your faith. They are the thing that matters the most, right? Love God, love your neighbor. Those are your neighbors.
mm,
If you don't figure that out, if you don't figure out how to love your neighbor, you can't love God. So they're not issues, and that's the thing. Don't let people. We let people compartmentalize these things. So they say, "Oh, I don't want to hear politics in church." What do you? Everything you do at church is political. You gather in a place. You own property. You talk
yeah,
about something that's going to make you go out and do good things in the community. Those are all political things, social and political. Now, when you say, I don't want to hear about like the Democratic Party at church, that's one thing. But to say it's not political is just absolutely ridiculous. It is totally ridiculous. And it's a compartmentalization. White folks are great about this. We have all these little compartments. We got to put our politics over here and our activism over here, and nothing talks to each other, right? But that means we're not an integrated, holistic person. We are divided from ourselves, and we're constantly unintegrated, right? We are schizophrenic, socially and philosophically, about our identity. And what I think we have to do is stop thinking about it as issues and thinking about it as relationships.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Although when you said schizophrenic, I was thinking about how my other good friend Dante D. King would say whiteness and white people are psychopathic. But we're not talking about that here today.
I can get into that for sure. Yeah, I can get into
Exactly. I know you can. But that, folks, is our time. As per usual, it flies. I mean, an hour comes and it goes and then it's gone. But this was amazing. Ben, we appreciate your time. We appreciate this conversation. I think it's definitely going to have an impact in getting people to think and understand a little bit different on how they look at the church, how they look at church leaders, and how they understand whiteness within the church, but also the anti-racism process and the struggle for justice and liberation for the global majority, which is our black people in the world. So thank you for your time. Thank you for all of this, and we appreciate
Thank
you,
you.
my
Appreciate you.
people. This has been another episode of the Untold Truth, and we are so glad that you could join us. So sit back and enjoy this wherever you are. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to having you back for the next one. Take care.